Have you ever come across a game where upon just looking at the concepts and direction, you find yourself baffled to such a high degree that you can't even remotely interpret the creative process behind its inception? Well, if not, congratulations, this just might be your first.
Okay, maybe I'm being a little harsh, but even after a full decade, this game mystifies me in relation to the rest of the series, or more accurately, lack thereof. This is also a game that I've talked about before in a Pac-Man World retrospective that I did a few years back, and I've referenced the game since. So if I've talked about it before, why talk about it now? Well, upon further analysis, I have a lot more to say about it, and I'm going to be covering the game from a variety of angles as opposed to just one like in my original video. First, I'm going to provide some context. In 1980, Toru Iwatani created Pac-Man in response to the focus of arcade games of the time. These games, while definitely classics, were largely targeted towards men, focusing on shooting down hostile creatures and other forms of violence. Pac-Man, on the other hand, was designed specifically with women in mind. Aside from the gameplay of these games often involving a blend of simplicity and complexity, a constant variable in the series that has always contributed to this is instead of having a badass hero and threatening villains, there's this emphasis on keeping everyone cute, likable, and identifiable. Even the 4 ghosts were designed with this in mind, which would explain why in the games where there's more of a conflict present, there's someone else telling them what to do, as otherwise their actions largely just amount to mischief. Evidently, future games would go further to establish and expand upon the characters' personalities, our titular character in particular. The very inappropriately named Pac-Man 2 The New Adventures is entirely based on having the player analyze Pac-Man's personality and use that knowledge to help guide him to perform whatever tasks he has to do. However, going back to gameplay, Pac-Man was never just a maze game. Even in the early 80s, the series tried all sorts of other genres like education, pinball, and in 1984, we started getting platformers. Pac-Land was one of the first side-scrolling platformers ever made, even before Super Mario Bros. Came into existence, and even then, that game had a fairly good understanding of what makes a platformer work. While the platforming sections weren't as frequent as subsequent platformers, the platforming itself was strongly tied to the environment, and any hazards you'd come across would be specific to that environment. However, Pac-Land is not what most people think of when talking about Pac-Man platformers. The Pac-Man World games, on the other hand, are. In fact, people who follow the Pac-Man series often cite Pac-Man World 2 as just as good, if not even better, than the original Pac-Man. Not only does it work in the conventions of the original game flawlessly, but it also takes the environment-based platforming of Pac-Land and takes it to unsurpassed heights, not just in the context of the Pac-Man series, but in platform games in general. And that's an area where I've definitely been around the block. Even if you're not a fan of the original Maze game, I still highly recommend looking into this. So, at last, we come to Pac-Man World 3. Now, this wasn't made by the team at Namco who worked on the World games. In fact, Namco didn't make it at all. The game was developed by Blitz Games, who are also responsible for Bad Boys Miami Takedown, Barbie Horse Adventures, Bratz Rock Angels, and Sneaking, which terrifyingly enough actually exists. So how do they continue the series of fast-paced, spectral-heavy platformers with a strong emphasis on interacting with the environment while also keeping true to Pac-Man's arcade roots? They make this one a bad beat-em-up that doesn't even feel remotely like a Pac-Man game, where platforming is rare, eating things serves no purpose, and a character who conveyed everything through his facial expressions and has been portrayed as a childlike innocent starts talking and makes bad sex jokes. Even the Wikipedia article says this game features more fighting and melee combat than the first 2 Pac-Man World games, which I find especially hilarious seeing how the other 2 games had none of that stuff, and for good reason. It's a stupid idea that doesn't complement the rest of the formula at all. However, that's not going to be an issue here, seeing how you're not going to be platforming very often. Instead, you're going to be hitting the B button in desperation, hoping in vain that the fight will end so you can just move on. The lack of relation to the other games in the series is the aspect of the game that I almost solely focused on the last time around, but I can't blame myself for a couple of reasons, one of which being that this is the most ridiculous sequel or continuation of a series I've ever seen in my entire life, and that includes popular choices like Shadow the Hedgehog and Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts. Seriously, just take any game, think of the most batshit insane sequel imaginable, and it wouldn't be that far off. Super Mario Sunshine 2. Now with an emphasis on hit-and-run gameplay, Mario goes on a quest using FLUDD to have sex with everyone on Isle Delfino. The less details you know, the better. Meanwhile, Mario starts talking more often and finds himself striking up conversation about President Nixon's Watergate scandal. Kirby journey into the new dimension. Kirby finally makes it into the third dimension. However, instead of eating enemies and platforming, Kirby puts his microphone to use and starts destroying enemies with his gangster rap. This introduces Kirby's new hit single, I'm Kirby, motherfucker. The second reason being that for a game this insane, it's shockingly boring. Even when putting aside the fact that this is supposed to be a Pac-Man game and the direct successor to debatably the best game in the series, it still does very little right. Which is actually kind of a shame because there's actually an aspect of this game that I think is a really good idea, which I'll get to later. First, let's talk about the story, which is something that this game puts a lot of focus on. On his 25th birthday, Pac-Man is teleported away from his home and into a landfill pit. Sometime later, Pac-Man meets up with Orson from the original Pac-Man World. You know, the kid ghost who controlled Talkman. Here, he's a full adult, despite the prior game taking place only 5 years before this. The confusingly aged Orson, who is now your friend, which to be fair is an idea that I actually like, informs Pac-Man that their home, the Spectral Realm, is being destroyed by the various siphons, created by a character that looks so out of place in a Pac-Man game it's actually kind of astounding. This is Erwin. He's a spoiled brat who wants more power and thus is recreating the events that destroyed their civilization called the Ancients. How did the Ancients die? What was their motivation behind their conquest of power? How did they manage to pull off the same things a mad scientist needs technology to pull off without technology?
Well, all of these questions and more are barely even hinted at, and are just established through throwaway lines.
With that, it's up to Pac-Man to save Pinky and Blinky, while Inky and Clyde are just kind of ignored until the final boss, as well as the Spectral Realm. Evidently, I have many problems with this plot. I know that it's kind of silly for me to be looking this deep into a plot in a Pac-Man game, but unlike many of the others, this game puts a lot of emphasis on its writing and storyline. I just mentioned most of my problems with the story, however there's more than that. For instance, there's the whole thing about the Ancients, which I have to say is a name that we have to stop using for lost civilizations in games. Every time I play a new game that they start talking about the Ancients, I can't help but jokingly think to myself, okay, are these the Pac-Man World 3 Ancients, the Lair Ancients, or the Sonic Boom Rise of Lyric Ancients? Seriously, it's getting old. That, and as I was talking about earlier, we know little to nothing about these people. Yeah, we see their ruins, but those ruins don't really convey anything. They could have used it to very cleverly have the environment help aid the story, but all we get are generic ruins and one line of dialogue saying that they wanted power but ended up dying without any further detail. Even going through their catacombs and with an archaeological expert who has studied the Ancients help guide us, we learn very little. We don't see any evidence of siphoning activity dating back to ages ago, or evidence as to why they did what they did, or even much of what they did at all. So when we get lines from Pac-Man like, Erwin, you're repeating the same mistakes as the Ancients, because we don't know what those mistakes were, and neither does Pac-Man for that matter, we're given no reason to care, but instead find ourselves questioning what foundations these claims have, only to be left with nothing. Then we have the Spectral Realm. According to this game, this is where the ghosts live and where they come from. And the other two Pac-Man World games, they live on Ghost Island. Do they even acknowledge Ghost Island in any way, shape, or form? Absolutely not. In my prior video, I tried to justify this by saying that Ghost Island may have just been an area of residence, whereas the Spectral Realm is where they come from. However, no. I was giving this game way too much credit. At the end, when the Spectral Realm is all but destroyed, the ghosts say that they have nowhere else to go. So my theory has been debunked. According to this game, Ghost Island never existed. This would be one thing, but this game makes a lot of references to the original Pac-Man World, which entirely took place on Ghost Island. Hell, that's where Pac-Man met Orson and destroyed Talkman. That's like making a new Sonic game that makes a lot of references to the original Genesis game, but apparently Green Hill Zone doesn't exist. It's like if in Return of the Jedi we got a scene like this. Go to the planet where you grew up, you must. Tatooine. Tatooine? What the fuck is? Raised by tauntauns on Hoth, you were. Now, Pac-Man and the Ghostly Adventures changes up the Ghost's origin story as well, but that takes place in an entirely different continuity. This is a direct successor. Also, the Ghostly Adventures series at the very least captured the tone of the series better and even kept the returning characters' personalities pretty close to the portrayals in prior games. Speaking of which, now we're going to talk about the character portrayals, because aside from the beat-em-up combat, this is the most infamous aspect of the game. In past Pac-Man titles, our titular character has been portrayed as a childlike innocent. He has the responsibilities of an adult and he likes helping other people, but he's not always good at doing it as, due to his sense of awe and wonder of the world around him, he can be very easily distracted. Even when he's not distracted and more determined to achieve his end goal, that childlike excitement of the world around him is a constant variable. However, he's not the most secure of characters, and he's also very emotional as well as very emotionally driven. He also tends to be very friendly and outgoing. Here, he's a whining, one-liner spewing, mean-spirited jerk. There's being out of character, and then there's Pac-Man's portrayal in Pac-Man World 3. Here's some of his dialogue if you don't believe me.
The main problem you face? Orson, I'm busy.
Great. Yep. Excellent start. Thank you.
Oh no, it's much more fun to see poor Pac-Man bounced around like a big yellow ball. Are you by any chance the idiot of whom we speak?
To be fair, there are like 1 or 2 times where Pac-Man acts somewhat in character, but it comes across as more by accident or coincidence than the actual understanding of the character. One thing that I've made a big deal of in the past is the fact that Pac-Man makes a couple of terrible sex jokes.
Uh-oh! I'm detecting a rise in energy in your sector, Pac-Man.
Details of my sector's energy should be between me and Miss Pac. Thank you very much.
Whenever I bring that up, I tend to hear at least a couple of people wondering what the big deal is. After all, a dirty joke in children's entertainment is not a rare occurrence. Despite what some people might think, I rarely ever take issue with this sort of thing, and even find it funny a lot of the time. So why do I take issue with it here? It's because it goes against the character. Pac-Man is one of the last characters who should be making a sex joke. I mean, what's next? Is he going to be killing children?
Okay, now, admittedly, Pac-Man is a pretty flexible character. I can imagine him doing plenty of weird things. In fact, he's done a lot of weird stuff in the past, but being this much of an annoying asshole on such a consistent basis, making sex jokes and killing children, let alone people at all. Those are like the definite things that I can't imagine him doing, but here we are.
It's like they were deliberately trying to get his personality as wrong as humanly possible. We're constantly told that this is Pac-Man that we're listening to, but since he acts virtually nothing like him, I can't help but feel that this is a completely different character. And I'm grateful to know that I am far from alone on that. It's especially insulting seeing how we had an entire game focus on Pac-Man's personality, and the prior 2 Pac-Man World games, which this is a direct continuation of, stayed true to that personality. In fact, even smaller games like Pac-Man World for the DS also followed that portrayal. It's almost like the game is saying, this is newer, better Pac-Man, but there's no way the game would be that insulting. The ever-growing Pac-Man is always looking to improve himself. As a result, you'll see a new and improved Pac-Man today. Let's move on to the 4 ghosts. I'll start by briefly talking about their portrayals in the other games, and then talk about their portrayals here. Also, throughout this video, I'm going to refer to the ghosts by their original and current names, as opposed to adhering to the Blinky Clyde error. Blinky is the leader of the ghosts, and is the toughest out of all of them. However, he has more of a playful side which pops up every now and then. Inky is the most mischievous of the group, Clyde is the idiot, and Pinky is a crazed psychopath who happens to have a crush on Pac-Man, which persists throughout the series. Here, Pinky is grounded in reality and fairly helpful, but neither her crush on Pac-Man nor her psychotic nature ever surface throughout the entire game, so she ends up feeling like a completely different character. Here, Clyde is not stupid, but instead more like a generic Blinky. However, Inky is the stupid one. Okay, seriously, what the hell? Even if you've never played any of the Pac-Man games aside from the first game, the ghosts' personalities were present even back then. Anyone who enjoys the original Pac-Man could probably tell you what the ghost personalities are, as a huge part of the game's strategy came from analyzing their behavior, and you couldn't even get that right. Out of all of the ghosts, Blinky is the closest to his original personality, though that's not saying much. He's the leader and he's tough, but none of that playfulness is present, and he talks like Joe Pesci?
Quit your daydreaming, Munchie. Come on, Orson needs you pronto-like.
Now, as for Miss Pac-Man and Orson, I actually like their portrayals here. Orson acts very different from his World 1 portrayal, but time has passed, and the idea of him maturing into how he's portrayed here is actually fairly plausible. Miss Pac-Man acts surprisingly in character. However, she's only in the game for like a minute. Also, if it hasn't already been apparent, the writing in this game is horrible. It tries to be dark, edgy, intriguing, and funny. However, it fails at all of those things, especially the humor. This game throws joke after joke at you, and while there are a couple of jokes that get a chuckle, and we get one consistently funny character later on, every other joke is cringeworthy. That and even the few decent jokes aren't very smart and don't have any lasting value. So upon playing this game multiple times, not that you'd want to, you're either going to find the dialogue boring or aneurysm-inducing. Despite not being very smart, it really tries to disguise itself as such. It's clear that the writers have a good vocabulary, but it's never used in a smart way.
Within the Spectral Realm, a sightless effect would be seen as a quasi-pseudo-distortion of its atomic fabric.
That and the references to past Pac-Man games and winks to Pac-Man fans beyond being very superficial are really phoned in.
A glitch in the Iwatani coil. Let's try again.
Hey Mario! Luigi needs you by the Miyamoto-mobile! What the fuck's a Miyamoto-mobile? Lazy fan service! So with all that out of the way, let's look at the gameplay. Now right off the bat, one thing that's apparent is that this game takes Pac-Man into dark, hostile environments. Now, I think that this is a great idea and a real missed opportunity. Granted, I don't think a Pac-Man game should ever be edgy, but Pac-Man World 2 worked largely due to the amount of tension in the platforming sections. You really got a sense of your own weight in that game, and they really emphasized on the hazards both in art direction and game design. So, if some of the most tense platforming that I've ever experienced came from colorful, snowy mountains, volcanoes, and so on, imagine what they could have done in dark, torture chamber-esque environments. The kinds of hazards you could make, how you present them, my god! There are so many possibilities for a dark Pac-Man World 2 style platformer, which makes the lack of platforming and the emphasis on beat-em-up combat all the more upsetting. It's also baffling that this game puts so much focus on the beat-em-up combat because, well, it's absolutely horrible at it. Let's start off by talking about Pac-Man's moveset. Like in the last two games, you have the butt bounce and rev roll. However, you no longer have the flip kick and they introduced the punch. So you have three means of attacks, but only the punch is consistently useful. I can't think of any instance past the last part of the tutorial where I used the rev roll for combat, and while there are some enemies where you can butt bounce on them, it really isn't effective with the exception of one. Enemies aren't crushed or flattened and hardly show any sign of impact. You'll butt bounce, roll off, butt bounce, roll off again, and so on. Whereas with the punching, you're constantly in a position to attack. So it's really the only useful option most of the time. Because of that, when they introduce variations of the enemies with spikes on their backs, it doesn't matter because you're not going to use the butt bounce anyway. The enemy design is not well done at all, and leaves little to no variation when it comes to how you approach each enemy. There's no strategy or really anything to make it an engaging experience. You just run up to an enemy, hit the same button over and over again until they eventually die. That and the problem with the enemies not showing any sign of impact upon being attacked is also a problem with the punching. And because that's virtually your sole means of attack, due to the lack of variation, you're going to be doing this a lot, and it's not going to be satisfying in any way, shape, or form. The enemies aren't a series of interesting obstacles, they're just massive irritants, and their placement is really unimaginative most of the time. You rarely ever fight against varying enemies with different amounts of strengths or anything, but instead fight hordes of the same enemy like a 5th grader's Game Maker project. Speaking of which, the art direction is like something out of the 5th grader's Game Maker project, with that 5th grader just going onto Google Images and using random resources as sprites for his new game called Clusterfuck. You get the original Pac-Man characters looking like Pac-Man characters, you get stuff that looks like it's from some really bad action cartoon show from the late 2000s, you get whatever the monsters are supposed to be, and most of the robots and machines look like they're ripped straight from Jak 2. You know what? I think Erwin traveled to Haven City, killed the Baron so he could raid the Crimson Guard, only to take the things that they never wanted in the first place. I would definitely criticize certain elements for being out of place, but it's quite evident that nothing was ever in place to begin with. However, with all that said, let's get back to the combat. Every once in a while, they'll throw in a power-up which, instead of affecting the gameplay in an interesting way, it serves as a lampshade to cover the game's repetition. Unfortunately for Blitz games, that lampshade couldn't possibly be any more transparent. Each power-up is neat at first, but it becomes very noticeable very quickly that none of them are very effective nor ever used in an interesting way. None of these power-ups ever have any use outside of the combat, whereas in something like Pac-Man and the Ghostly Adventures, the power-ups not only help you eat the ghosts, but also manipulate the environment and are used very cleverly in that regard. Here, not only is the application of these power-ups significantly weaker, but it also doesn't help that they're all introduced fairly early on, so even this game's only source of variation when it comes to the combat sails into the repetition as well, so it comes across as more pointless than anything. Then we have an additional set of combat sequences where ghost substitutes called Spectral Monsters come in, and we have to eat all of them in order for their portals to close. This is their painful attempt to phone in standard Pac-Man conventions, however it feels to be anywhere near as fun or engaging as eating ghosts was in the other games. Why is that? It's because in the other games there was actual strategy to it. Your goal was to eat all of the Pac Dots and the ghosts limited where you could be and when. You have to be very careful about how you approached each stage, including the use of the 4 power pellets. Eating the ghost is satisfying because it often happens when you're on the verge of being touched by one and losing a life. So to have the power dynamic shift into your favor right at that instant results in a strong sense of catharsis and satisfaction. Here, there's no strategy whatsoever, as there are no other variables to take into account. You just eat a power pellet, eat them, wait for more to come out, rinse and repeat. That and these sections can last a while, just as long if not longer than the regular beat-em-up fights. However, the fights and the eating sections both have the same problems. They're not satisfying, they bring the game to a halt. They happen every 5 seconds, and they're beyond repetitive. This means when you get a bunch of these sections back to back, which happens quite often, it gets really, really annoying. And that's exactly what any enemy interaction of any kind in this game amounts to, an annoying waste of time that only serves to slow the game down. Not that this game needs any help with that, seeing how long these levels are. In Pac-Man World 2, a level could range from 5 to 10 minutes to get through. In Pac-Man World 3, on the other hand, a level can easily range from 45 minutes to over an hour to complete. Very little of that is devoted to platforming, some of it is for puzzle solving, but a vast majority of it is for the combat and spectral monsters. And because of that repetition, it's much easier than any of the other games of the series. You quickly become adjusted to pressing the B button repeatedly and hoping that these dumb enemies die, and even the different enemies are all introduced fairly early on, so essentially you're just doing the same thing over and over again for several hours on end. Whereas the other games in the series constantly changed up its platforming challenges, and because something new was being introduced in each stage, it resulted in each respective game being interesting and challenging as opposed to boring and easy. However, I've talked enough about the combat. Let's talk about some of the other stuff. The music in the game is not often present, and when it is, it's not bad. A lot of it is much nicer to listen to on its own because it doesn't really match the mood that the game is going for a lot of the time. I really felt that some of these songs should have played during other parts of the game or should have been replaced with different songs altogether. For instance, you return to the Spectral Realm for the last time. It's on the brink of collapse. Keep in mind, in this game, this is where the ghosts were born, raised, and lived their lives. That, and we hear about Orson's memories there and how sad he is about all of this. In my opinion, if the music was more urgent to suggest that the realm is collapsing, but with a sad and more emotional melody, I think that this could have resulted in a really nice moment. However, we're left with not much of anything, and because the game design isn't really taking advantage of this setup either, it results in copious amounts of boredom instead of eliciting an emotional response.
The music and the game are very much like two different trains moving in opposite directions. I mean, the music is definitely alright on its own, but because it doesn't match the game super well, it only contributes to the overall sensory deprivation that you're going to experience.
However, when the mood of the music and game match, then you're more likely to get enjoyment out of it. During the second Spectral Realm stage, after you free Blinky, you run into this thing called the Spectral Fiend. He's the one who blocked up Blinky earlier and has interacted with Pac-Man in the prior Spectral Realm stage. The Spectral Fiend sends all sorts of spectral monsters their way, and there are no power pellets in sight, so it's up to Blinky to fight off the hordes of spectral monsters. This is actually a moderately fun moment, mostly due to the more hectic tone in comparison to the rest of the game, and the music actually contributes to that fair deal.
Carefully. It's
That, and while I feel that Erwin is a very underwhelming villain, especially in comparison to Spooky, I really like the theme that they give him. Also, when you enter the ancient catacombs, I love it when the choir and strings come in, as it just creates this really uncomfortable mood. However, more often we get songs that are largely just mediocre, and they don't always match the game very well. This game had 4 composers, and I suspect that some had a better idea of what to do than others, probably due to bad direction, which I'll get to later. So overall, the music fails to reach the same standard of many of the other great soundtracks of the series, and especially after Pac-Man World 2, this is pretty underwhelming, albeit not that bad. The puzzles are some of the most boring and simplistic that I've ever seen. Any thought process is not needed, and they mostly involve a series of fetch quests. In short, they're not engaging in the slightest, and they go on way too long. One thing that I will give this game credit for is that it tries to be more wide open and exploration driven than World 2. Traversing these small areas of diversion is also where most of the platforming comes in, whereas the main path is much more built to accommodate the beat 'em up combat. They also hide fruit and collectibles in pretty clever spots. However, while they got the freedom aspect of exploration down, they forgot one of the other crucial components: incentive. It's evident that they're trying to mimic how Pac-Man World 2 handled this concept, but in that game, if you 100% completed a level, you were awarded with tokens, which would help you unlock a music hall, concept art, as well as the earlier arcade games. In Pac-Man World 3, you are awarded with a trading card, which probably took less time to make than it takes to get. Also, Pac-Dots, the key essential collectible in the Pac-Man series, serves no purpose whatsoever. Yeah, you get points for all of this stuff, but those points serve no purpose aside from getting a high score at the end of each level. And with levels this long, I'm definitely going to have my friends and I go through each stage trying to get more points than the other. So the only thing the exploration really does in the long run is make the already tediously long levels even longer. Also, as much as I like the concept of Pac-Man being in dark environments, I'm not that big of a fan of the environments that they chose. While I think putting Pac-Man in dangerous, hostile environments has a lot of potential, I think putting him in ugly or colorless environments isn't. It also doesn't help that not only are you going to be stuck in this environment for a while, due to the stage being much longer, but this game has you revisit the same environments multiple times in subsequent levels. Yes, this is one of those games. However, even with the environments that I think were good ideas like ancient catacombs, unstable buildings, and so on, I never felt that they took advantage of these environments at all. Despite being told that we're in dangerous environments, I never felt like I was in danger. In Pac-Man World 2, you feel that danger with every jump you make, and it's really a shame that such things aren't really explored here. Even when traversing a dimensional reality that is on the verge of collapsing, or being in a building that hasn't been under maintenance in a long time and was very unstable to begin with, I felt shockingly secure. That sense of danger from World 2 is barely present at all. There's only one stage in the entire game where I felt that they even handled this adequately. As far as the platforming goes, it's the highlight of the game, but only because the rest of the game is unbearably boring. I say this because the platforming is far from great either. To start, I should say that while Pac-Man controls fairly well, you have significantly less control over his movement than you did in Pac-Man World 2. They also add a few more gimmicks to the platforming like pole swinging and pole sliding, which feel really automated and require very little input on the player's part. That and even the returning bedoings are severely downgraded, sending you in a predetermined direction as opposed to letting the player soar through the air with full player input available. While the spectacle from the other World games came from how your interactions affected environments and then you in return. In short, very little was automated, allowing the player to feel the danger associated with every move that they make. Here, all that is taken away from you. Granted, they try to make certain platforming sections look like those from World 2, but either they're interrupted by more beat-em-up combat, or they weren't laid that well to begin with. Sometimes it's both. However, Let's talk about the one level that consistently handled these things okay, Gogeka Heights. In this stage, you return to the Gogeka building only to see that Erwin has set it on fire. Here, you'll be climbing up structures as the room fills with acid, jumping on swinging platforms over a fiery abyss, and other things like that. There's actual danger below you while you jump from platform to platform, and there's more platforming here than the other stages, so this really helps it stand out. Could they have gone further with it, done more, and provided even more dangerous things to interact with? Yes, but you know what? I'll take what I can get. That and the music actually fits the setup provided and sounds like something from a Pac-Man World game. That and the two bosses, while pretty much exactly the same, actually require you to use the Reveral and Butt Bounce to defeat it, and because it matches Pac-Man's existing moveset, it feels more like something from a World game. So the game does have its highlights every now and then. However, they're buried under an onslaught of terrible beat-em-up combat, boring puzzles, and endless repetition. Not to mention, not even the highlights of the game match up to what the prior two games achieved, but instead just adequately mimicked them. This is definitely one of the worst games in the Pac-Man series. It's not the worst game in the world or anything, but it doesn't execute many things right, executes a lot of stuff badly, and confusingly enough focuses and emphasizes on what it gets wrong and hides what little it does right in the closet. I don't blame the programmers, game designers, musicians, or whatever. It's clear that they have some talent, but it's all wasted by the game's absolutely atrocious direction. This is easily one of the worst directed games that I have ever seen in my life, and it brings the rest of the game down with it. Directors in games shouldn't be just a thing for artsy titles or something of that sort. A good game needs good direction, because when you get a game that very clearly has no idea what the fuck it's doing, it'll turn out like Pac-Man World 3. It's hard to believe a game like this could even exist. Yes, Pac-Man 2 The New Adventures is often looked at as more of a ridiculous sequel, however that game wasn't designed as a sequel. It was originally called Hello Pac-Man in Japan, and the name was changed to Pac-Man 2 when it made its way over to the West. I also take less issue with that game, seeing how it's a good and very interesting game on its own. This isn't.
Also, you know how earlier I said that I couldn't remotely interpret the creative process behind the game's inception? Well, with a little further digging, I was able to. And this gets really weird. A lot of the concepts from this game came from a cancelled Pac-Man game called Pac-Man Adventures. You wanna know who had a big hand in the creative process behind that project? Don Bluth. And it shows, because looking at the concept art and everything, it's much more inspired and interesting than what this game ever provided. Even the robots and things like that had much more varied enemy designs, and I actually could see working in a Pac-Man game. But no, we couldn't have any of that stuff. Instead, we had to have watered-down Jak 2 substitute. Don't worry, Mr. Bluth, we're handling all of your ideas with care and consideration. Yo, Tom, have you finished ripping the assets from Jak 2 yet?
Not quite, they came out kinda weird.
Well, salvage what you can! Speaking of which, I wonder how the level designers are holding up.
Normally, I appreciate it when a sequel tries out something different as long as it maintains some form of direction. However, it's like this game was actively trying to destroy any form of connection, and in this case, ironically, trying to be different resulted in the game having less of an identity. Taking platformer series and making them dark, edgy beat-em-ups was oddly enough a trend back then. And it's a trend that is not looked back on very fondly. So this change in the format not only feels out of place within the context of the game itself, but it appears that it was done not out of some artistic vision, but instead because other people were doing it for some inexplicable reason. Yes, platformers don't have to always be lighthearted, and there's a lot of stuff you can do with platforming in a dark setting that you otherwise wouldn't be able to. I evidently think both have their place, and it's a shame that very few good dark platformers exist, as I do think the potential is there. However, making this a beat-em-up is quite frankly one of the absolute stupidest things that you could have done with this, and it's not even good at being a beat-em-up. I was really angry at this game for a long time because it seemed like this was the last attempt at a Pac-Man adventure game, but recently, we've got the Pac-Man The Ghostly Adventures games, which are absolutely great. Pac-Man The Ghostly Adventures 2 in particular is one of the best platformers I've played in years. So that source of bitterness isn't there anymore, but even with that gone, we're still left with not a good game. As always, if you disagree with me, that's fine. If you like this game, feel free to like it. However, for me, it's not worth the trouble.